6 months after that earthquake changed everything, James found himself sitting in a congressional hearing room in Washington, D.C., wearing the only suit he owned. The room was intimidating, with its high ceilings and dark wood paneling and rows of senators and representatives looking down at him from behind their curved desk. His hands felt rough and out of place on the polished wood table in front of him. "Mr. Miller," a senator from Nebraska began, "can you describe for the committee what it was like to discover this Cold War bunker on your property?" James had told this story so many times now that he could recite it in his sleep. But he tried to keep it fresh, tried to remember that day and the shock of seeing those concrete steps leading down into darkness. He told them about the tremor, about the hole in the ground, about descending into the bunker and finding evidence that someone had been living there. The congressional committee was investigating how many of these forgotten bunkers existed across the country and what should be done about them. James's discovery had triggered a nationwide audit, and what they'd found was alarming. Over 300 similar facilities, most of them abandoned and forgotten, many of them still accessible to anyone who knew where to look. "These facilities represent a security risk," another senator said. "They could be used for criminal activity, terrorism, who knows what else." "What do you think should be done with them, Mr. Miller?" James thought about it. "I'm just a farmer, not a security expert. But it seems to me that if we built these things, we have a responsibility to make sure they're either properly secured or properly closed. What happened on my land, that shouldn't happen anywhere else." The committee agreed. Congress allocated funding to address the issue, to seal or demolish the bunkers that couldn't be secured, to repurpose the ones that could be useful. Some would become museums preserving Cold War history. Others would be properly sealed with concrete and monitoring systems to ensure they stayed sealed. After James testified, he had a few hours before his flight back to Kansas. He walked around Washington, feeling out of place in his suit among all the tourists and business people. He stopped at the World War II Memorial, looking at the names carved in stone, thinking about all the wars that had shaped his country. The Cold War was different. It was a war that never quite happened, but the fear of it had been real enough to build hundreds of underground bunkers across the nation. His phone buzzed. It was a text from Helen with a photo attached. Their kids standing in front of the sealed bunker entrance on their property, next to the new historical marker that had been installed. The marker explained what the site was, its history, why it mattered. Their farm had become a piece of American history, whether they wanted it to be or not. The flight home was delayed, giving James time to think about everything that had happened. The media attention had finally died down mostly. The news crews had moved on to other stories, but the impact of the discovery lingered in ways both obvious and subtle. The property value of the farm had increased significantly. Real estate agents had started calling within weeks of the discovery, offering ridiculous amounts of money. James and Helen had laughed about it at first, then gotten annoyed by the constant calls, then finally just stopped answering numbers they didn't recognize. They had no intention of selling. This was their home, their family's land. A bunker underneath it didn't change that. But the discovery had changed things in other ways too. Tourism had picked up in their small town. People wanted to see where it had happened, wanted to drive by the farm and take photos. The local diner had started serving something called the Bunker Burger. The hardware store sold t-shirts with a drawing of the farm and the words, "Historic Site," printed underneath. James found it all a bit much, but he understood it. Small towns needed whatever economic boost they could get. The FBI had closed their investigation of the bunker itself, though Derek Holloway's case was still winding through the legal system. The money he'd returned had been given back to the agricultural cooperative, helping to make some people whole who'd lost their retirement savings. It didn't fix everything, but it helped. James had received letters from all over the country, some from historians thanking him for preserving such an important piece of Cold War history, some from other property owners who'd discovered similar bunkers on their land after hearing about James's story, a few from people who'd worked in the bunker back in the 60s or whose parents had, sharing memories and photographs. One letter stood out. It was from a woman in Florida whose father had been one of the engineers who'd designed the bunker system. She included photos of her dad as a young man, standing in front of the construction site before it was buried underground. She thanked James for bringing attention to her father's work that had been classified and forgotten for decades. Her father had died years ago, she wrote, but he would have been pleased to know his project was finally being recognized. When James finally got home, it was late evening. Helen was waiting up for him, and they sat together on the porch like they did most nights, looking out over their land. The fields were ready for spring planting. Life was getting back to normal, or what passed for normal now. How was Washington? Helen asked. Big. Intimidating. I'm glad to be home. The kids want to know if you met the president. James laughed. No, just a bunch of senators and representatives. They seemed like decent people mostly, concerned about the bunker situation. Good. Someone should be concerned about it. They sat in comfortable silence for a while. James thought about Derek Holloway, probably settling into prison life right about now. He wondered if Derek ever thought about the farm, about the bunker, about all those years spent hiding in the dark. He hoped Derek would find some kind of peace eventually, some way to live with what he'd done. A museum in Topeka wants to do an exhibit about the bunker, Helen said. They called yesterday. Want to borrow some of the artifacts that the FBI released, display them with information about Cold War history. They asked if we'd be willing to participate, maybe do a talk or something. What do you think? James asked. I think it might be nice. Turn something strange into something educational. Help people understand that part of history. James nodded. Yeah, okay. We can do that. Over the next few months, life slowly returned to its regular rhythm. James planted his crops, tended his cattle, fixed fences and machinery. The farm work never ended, and he was grateful for that. It gave him something to focus on besides bunkers and criminals and congressional hearings. The museum exhibit opened in the fall. James and Helen drove to Topeka for the opening ceremony. It was strange seeing artifacts from under their farm displayed in glass cases with professional lighting and explanatory text. The old radio equipment, some of the signs from the tunnel walls, photographs and documents from the 60s. There was even a replica of one of the bunker rooms, built to show people what it had been like down there. A section of the exhibit focused on Derek and Richard Holloway's use of the bunker. It was handled sensitively, James thought, explaining how they'd hidden there without sensationalizing it. There were photos of them from before they disappeared, looking like any other father and son. The exhibit noted that Derek had cooperated fully with authorities and returned the stolen money. James gave his talk to a room full of people, maybe 100 or so, mostly older folks who remembered the Cold War and younger people interested in history. He told the story again, the earthquake, the discovery, everything that followed. During the question and answer session afterward, someone asked if he'd ever been scared, knowing 2 criminals had been under his land. Not scared exactly, James said, more unsettled. But they never hurt anyone. They were just trying to survive, trying to hide from the consequences of their actions. Doesn't make what they did right, but it doesn't make them monsters either. Another person asked if he'd change anything if he could go back. James thought about it for a long time before answering. I don't know. Part of me wishes that earthquake had never happened, that we'd never found the bunker. Life was simpler before, but another part of me thinks maybe it's good that these things come to light, that hidden things shouldn't stay hidden forever. That Christmas, James and Helen's kids came home from college for the holidays. They were adults now, or nearly so, and they saw their parents and the farm differently than they had before. Over dinner one night, their son asked James what he thought the most important thing was that had come from the whole experience. James set down his fork, considering the question seriously. I think it reminded me that the world is bigger and stranger than we usually realize. That there's hidden history all around us, literally under our feet sometimes, and that people are complicated. Nobody's completely good or completely bad. We all make choices, and sometimes those choices trap us for years or decades. Their daughter asked if James ever went to see where the bunker entrance had been. James admitted he went there sometimes, usually early in the morning when the light was just starting to break. He'd stand by the sealed concrete plug and the historical marker and think about everything that had happened, about the Cold War workers who'd built it, the officials who'd planned to use it, the father and son who'd hidden in it, and the earthquake that had finally revealed it all. Spring came again, as it always did. James started another planting season. News came that Derek Holloway was doing well in prison, had enrolled in educational programs, was teaching other inmates how to read. He'd sent a letter to James, not asking for anything, just saying that he thought about the farm sometimes, about how peaceful it had looked from a distance. James wrote back, He didn't know why exactly, but it felt like the right thing to do. He told Derek about the museum exhibit, about how his story was being used to teach people about Cold War history, and about the consequences of our choices. He told him that the farm was doing well, that life had gone on. Derek wrote back a month later. His letter was thoughtful, reflective. He talked about having time to really think about his life, about the path that had led him to stealing and running and hiding. He said he was trying to become someone his father would have been proud of, someone he himself could be proud of. It would take years, he wrote, but he had time now. Nothing but time. One evening in late summer, James and Helen had some of their neighbors over for dinner. The conversation eventually turned to the bunker, like it often did. People still had questions, still wanted to hear about it firsthand. But James noticed something had changed. The story didn't dominate the conversation anymore. They talked about crops and weather and local politics. The bunker was becoming just another part of their history, not the defining thing. After everyone left, James walked out to the east pasture one more time. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant colors. The old oak tree stood where it always had, looking no different than it had a year ago. The sealed bunker entrance was barely visible in the fading light, just a patch of newer concrete and a historical marker. James thought about all the secrets the earth held, all the hidden places and forgotten stories. His land had kept this secret for decades, and now it had given it up. He wondered what other secrets were out there, waiting to be discovered, waiting for their own earthquakes to bring them to light. But mostly he felt grateful. Grateful that nobody had been hurt, that the story had ended as well as it could have, that his family was safe and his farm was thriving. Life had gotten complicated for a while, but it had also gotten richer in some ways. He'd learned things about history and human nature that he'd never have learned otherwise. As he walked back toward the house, he felt the ground beneath his feet, solid and steady. No tremors tonight, no surprises hiding below, just good Kansas soil and the quiet satisfaction of a day's work done. Helen was waiting on the porch, and together they watched the last light fade from the sky, ready for whatever tomorrow might bring. The day Derek Holloway stepped off the plane in Kansas City, flanked by FBI agents and U.S. Marshals, James was there. Not because he wanted to be, really, but because Agent Robert had asked him to come. Said it might help with the case. Having the property owner there when Derek gave his first statement on American soil, James wasn't sure how his presence would help anything. But he'd gotten used to doing things that didn't make much sense over the past month. Derek looked smaller than James had imagined. The security camera footage had made him seem bigger, more threatening somehow. But in person, he was just a tired-looking man in his late 40s with thinning hair and the kind of exhausted eyes that come from years of not sleeping well. He was handcuffed, wearing clothes that looked expensive but worn, like he'd been traveling in them for days. At the federal building downtown, James sat in an observation room while Derek was questioned. He could see through the one-way glass, could hear everything through speakers mounted in the ceiling. It was strange, watching this man who'd been living under his farm talk about it like he was discussing someone else's life. My father worked for the county clerk's office one summer when he was in college, Derek said, his voice quiet but steady. This was back in 1982. Part of his job was filing old documents, sorting through decades of county records. He found blueprints and construction documents for the bunker. Back then, a lot of those Cold War projects were being declassified or just forgotten about. He made copies of everything, thought it was interesting history. Agent Robert, sitting across from Derek, made notes on a legal pad. And he kept those documents for 20 years? He was a pack rat. Kept everything. We had boxes in our attic full of old papers, books, maps. The bunker blueprints were just part of his collection of local history stuff. I remember him showing them to me when I was a teenager, telling me about how scared people were back in the 60s, how they thought nuclear war was inevitable. James watched Derek's face as he talked. There was no defiance there, no anger, just resignation, like a man who'd been carrying a heavy weight for so long that he'd forgotten what it felt like to stand up straight. When did you and your father decide to steal from the cooperative? Robert asked. Derek was quiet for a long moment. It wasn't sudden. It started small. Dad was having financial problems. Medical bills from when my mom got sick. She died in 2001, and the bills just kept coming even after she was gone. He started moving money around, little amounts at first, thinking he'd pay it back. But then it got bigger. And I knew what he was doing, and I should have stopped him, but I didn't. You helped him? Yeah, I helped him. I thought we could take enough to cover the debts and fix everything. But once you start, it's hard to stop. We took more and more, and then one day we realized someone was going to notice soon. So we had to decide, do we turn ourselves in? Or do we run? You chose to run. We chose wrong, Derek said simply. We chose to run, and it destroyed our lives. 22 years of looking over our shoulders, never staying in one place too long, never making real friends, never having anything that felt like home. Robert flipped through his notes. Tell me about the bunker. When did you first go there? Right after we left town. Dad remembered the old blueprints and thought, maybe we could hide there for a while, let things cool down. We drove out to the grain silo, found the entrance just like the blueprints showed. It was amazing how easy it was to get in. No locks, no security, just a door that hadn't been opened in decades. Derek described their first time in the bunker, how dark it was, how cold, how eerie it felt to walk through corridors that had been built to save people from nuclear war, but had just been abandoned and forgotten. They'd brought camping gear, food, water, planned to stay a few weeks at most. But weeks turned into months, Derek said. We'd leave sometimes, drive to different cities, stay in cheap motels, try to figure out what to do next. But we always came back to the bunker. It felt safe. Nobody knew it was there. Nobody was looking for us in an abandoned Cold War facility. How long did you use the bunker? On and off for about 19 years. We'd spend 2 or 3 months there, then leave for a while, then come back. We tried to live normal lives in between, found places we could work under fake names, saved money. But we always had the bunker to come back to when things got dangerous. James listened to all of this through the speakers, trying to imagine it. 19 years of hiding in the dark under his farm. 19 years of these two men coming and going while he plowed fields and planted crops and lived his life up above, never knowing they were there. Robert asked about the security cameras, and Derek explained they'd installed them about 2 years ago. His father's health was failing, and Derek worried about something happening to him down there with no way to call for help. The cameras were motion-activated, battery-powered, meant to give them some warning if anyone else discovered the bunker. We almost got caught a few times, Derek said. Once a county surveyor came out to the grain silo, some kind of inspection. We heard him up above, heard him walking around. We didn't move or make a sound for 3 hours until he left. Another time, some kids were playing near the entrance, and we had to wait until dark to sneak out. What about James Miller, the farmer who owns the land where the main bunker entrance is? We saw him sometimes from a distance, working his fields, driving his tractor. Seemed like a good man. I felt guilty about being under his land without him knowing. But what could we do? Turn ourselves in? Robert's next question made Derek's face change, made him look even more tired than before. When did your father die? 6 years ago. We were in Portugal, in a little town on the coast. We'd been trying to make a life there, both of us working odd jobs, learning Portuguese. Dad had a heart attack. By the time I got him to a hospital, it was too late. He died 3 days later. Why didn't you come back to the States then? And say what? Hi, I'm Derek Holloway, the guy who helped steal $2 million 22 years ago. I'd like to turn myself in now. I was scared. So I stayed in Portugal for a while, then moved to Spain. But I kept thinking about the bunker. It was the only place that had ever felt safe, even though I hated it. I went back a few times over those 6 years. Would spend a week or two there, just sitting in the dark, trying to figure out what to do with my life. When was the last time you were there? March of last year. I knew I couldn't keep doing it anymore. Living under a fake name, always worried someone would figure out who I really was. I went back to the bunker one last time. Stayed there for 2 weeks just thinking. I decided I was going to turn myself in. But I was scared, so I kept putting it off. And then that earthquake happened and everything came out anyway. The questioning went on for hours. Derek told them everything, where the stolen money was, the bank accounts they'd used, the fake identities they'd created. He showed them how to access offshore accounts where most of the money had been sitting untouched for years. He gave them names of people who'd helped them, mostly criminals they'd paid for fake passports and documents. I want to pay it all back, Derek said at one point. Everything we took. I know it doesn't fix what we did, but I want to try to make it right. When the questioning finally ended, Agent Robert came into the observation room where James was sitting. What do you think? He asked. James didn't know what to think. He seemed sorry. He is sorry. That's pretty clear. But sorry doesn't change what he did. He's going to prison, probably for a long time. But his cooperation will help. The money he's returning, the information he's providing about the people who helped them, it all matters. Over the next few weeks, Derek's story became public. The news coverage intensified. People had strong opinions like they always did. Some felt sorry for him, said he'd suffered enough. Others wanted him to face the maximum sentence, said he'd stolen from hardworking people and deserved no mercy. James tried not to pay attention to any of it. The federal government decided what to do with the bunker. It was too expensive to fill in or demolish completely, so they sealed it properly this time. The main entrance on James's property was filled with concrete, marked with a plaque explaining what it was. The secondary entrance at the grain silo was also sealed. The bunker would stay down there, a buried piece of Cold War history that had accidentally become a hiding place for two desperate men. James was called to testify at Derek's sentencing hearing. He didn't want to go, but the prosecutor said his perspective as the property owner mattered. So he sat in a courtroom in Kansas City and told the judge about finding the hole in his pasture, about discovering that someone had been living under his land for nearly 20 years. "How do you feel about what Mr. Holloway did?" the judge asked him. James thought carefully before answering. "I think what he and his father did was wrong. Stealing is wrong, and running from it for 22 years was wrong. But I also think they paid for it in their own way. They gave up their whole lives. They lived in darkness and fear for 2 decades. That's not nothing." The judge sentenced Derek to 12 years in federal prison, less than the prosecution wanted but more than the defense had hoped for. With time served and good behavior, he'd likely be out in 8 or 9 years. The judge noted his cooperation, his remorse, and the fact that he'd returned almost all of the stolen money. After the sentencing, Derek's lawyer asked if James would be willing to meet with him. James almost said no, but Helen convinced him it might bring some closure. So they met in a conference room at the federal building, just the two of them and a guard standing by the door. "I'm sorry," Derek said immediately, "for everything. For stealing, for hiding under your land, for all of it." James nodded. "I believe you. Your farm, it's beautiful. The times I saw it from a distance, I thought about how peaceful it looked. I thought about how I'd thrown away my chance at a life like that, something honest and simple. I envied you." "Nothing simple," James said. "But I get what you mean." They talked for 20 minutes. Derek told James about his father, about how the guilt had eaten at him for years until the heart attack finally took him. He told James about the bunker, about what it was like to live down there in the darkness using Cold War supplies left over from a war that never happened. "There's one thing I want you to know," Derek said. "We never disturbed anything on your land, never stole from you, never damaged anything. We were ghosts and we tried to stay that way." "I know," James said. "Agent Robert told me. You could have done a lot worse, I suppose." When they said goodbye, Derek shook James's hand. "Thank you for not hating me." "I don't hate you," James said honestly. "I don't know exactly what I feel, but it's not hate." The name Richard Holloway meant nothing to James at first. He'd never heard of the man, never crossed paths with him as far as he knew. But as Agent Robert pulled up files and photos on his laptop, James started to understand just how big this whole thing had become. This wasn't just about a tunnel under his farm anymore. This was about 2 men who'd been hiding from the law for over 2 decades. And somehow they'd been doing it right beneath his feet. In 2003, Richard Holloway was the chief financial officer for Prairie States Agricultural Cooperative, Robert explained, turning the laptop so James could see better. His son Derek worked there too in the accounting department. Over the course of about 18 months, they managed to embezzle $2.3 million. Small amounts at first, then bigger and bigger. By the time anyone noticed, they were gone. The photos showed 2 men in their 40s and early 20s back then. Richard had graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses, looking like any middle-aged businessman you'd pass on the street. Derek looked younger, nervous even in the official company photo. Both of them just looked like regular people, not criminals, not the kind of people who'd steal millions and then vanish. The FBI searched for them for years, Robert continued. Checked border crossings, monitored their bank accounts, followed up on hundreds of tips. Nothing. It was like they disappeared into thin air. Until now. James leaned back in his chair, trying to process it all. So they've been living down there? All this time? Not continuously, we don't think. The evidence suggests they used the bunker as a hideout, probably living there for weeks or months at a time, then going somewhere else. The camera footage only goes back about 18 months, but based on the wear patterns on the floors, the age of some of the supplies we found, they've probably been using this place on and off since they disappeared. But how? How did they even know about it? That was the question everyone wanted answered. Over the next week, as the FBI continued their investigation, pieces of the story started coming together. They found documents in one of the chambers, old county records that Richard Holloway had apparently stolen or copied decades ago when he worked a summer job for the county clerk's office back in the early 80s. Records about Cold War-era construction projects, including the bunker system under what would eventually become James's farm. He knew about this place for years. Robert explained to James during one of their many conversations. Probably thought of it as interesting local history, but when he needed to disappear, he remembered it. The secondary entrance under the old grain silo was on foreclosed property that nobody was monitoring. He could come and go without anyone noticing. The FBI brought in a historian named Dr. Patricia Wilson from the State University. She specialized in Cold War history, and she spent days going through the bunker with a team, documenting everything, taking photographs, analyzing the construction and design. "This is extraordinary," she told James one afternoon as they stood in the main chamber. Facilities like this were built all over the country during the late 50s and early 60s. The government was genuinely worried about nuclear war with the Soviet Union. They built these bunkers to ensure continuity of government, places where officials could shelter and continue operating even after a nuclear attack. She showed James blueprints they'd found in one of the filing cabinets, yellowed with age but still readable. The bunker system was even more extensive than they'd initially thought. 12 major chambers, yes, but also dozens of smaller rooms, storage areas, and connecting corridors. There was even a small infirmary in one section, complete with hospital beds and medical equipment that looked like it belonged in a museum. "Who was supposed to use this place?" James asked. "Based on the documents we've found, this was designated for mid-level agricultural department officials from the region. In the event of nuclear war, they'd bring their families here. The bunker was designed to be self-sufficient for up to 6 months. They had water storage, air filtration systems, backup generators, everything you'd need to wait out the worst of the fallout." James walked through the chambers day after day, even when he didn't need to be there, even when the investigators told him he should probably stay topside. He felt drawn to the place, fascinated and disturbed in equal measure. In one of the living quarters, he found a child's drawing tucked into a crack in the wall. It showed a house and a family, stick figures holding hands under a smiling sun. Some kid had drawn that picture down here in the darkness, waiting for a nuclear war that never came. The supplies they found told their own story. Canned vegetables from companies that didn't exist anymore. Condensed milk with expiration dates from 1967. Boxes of crackers that had long since turned to dust. Medical supplies in sealed containers, antibiotics and painkillers and bandages, all carefully labeled and organized. Someone had gone to great lengths to stock this place, to make sure the people who sheltered here could survive. But the bunker had been abandoned sometime in the mid-60s, as far as the historians could tell. The Cold War tensions had eased slightly, and budget cuts meant facilities like this one were quietly shut down. The entrances were supposed to be sealed, but clearly that hadn't happened properly. The secondary entrance under the grain silo had never been sealed at all, just left as it was when an agricultural business that used the silo went bankrupt. The FBI's forensic team found DNA evidence throughout the recently used areas. Hair samples, fingerprints, traces of skin cells. Everything pointed to the same two people, Richard and Derek Holloway. They found a journal in one of the rooms, handwritten entries that Derek had apparently made during their time in hiding. Agent Robert read some of the entries to James. They were sad, mostly. Derek writing about missing his friends, missing normal life, wondering if they'd ever be able to stop running. Some entries talked about his father's declining health, about arguments they'd had in the darkness of the bunker. A few entries from the last year or so mentioned that they couldn't keep living this way, that they needed to figure out a way forward. The last entry is from March of last year, Robert said. Derek writes that they're leaving for good, that his father isn't well enough to keep doing this. After that, nothing. The cameras show them leaving with bags and they never came back. Where did they go? James asked. That's what we're trying to figure out now. We've got agencies in 14 countries looking for them. If Richard needed medical care, there'll be records somewhere. We'll find them. While the manhunt continued, the discovery of the bunker had started making national news. James's farm was famous now, whether he wanted it to be or not. News crews from major networks came out to do stories. His face ended up on television, in newspapers, on websites. The farmer who found the secret bunker, one headline called him. Helen started keeping a scrapbook of all the articles, though James wasn't sure why. He didn't feel famous. He felt overwhelmed. Other discoveries kept coming. In one of the sealed chambers that took the FBI 3 days to get into, they found something that made everyone stop and think. It was a small room, maybe 10 feet by 10 feet, and it was full of children's things. Toys from the early 60s, small beds, books and games and stuffed animals. A whole playroom, frozen in time, waiting for children who had never come. Families, Dr. Wilson said softly when they opened that room. They really planned to bring whole families down here. Children included. Can you imagine? Telling your kids that the world above was ending, that they had to live in this underground place for months, maybe longer. James couldn't imagine it. He thought about his own kids, now teenagers, and what it would be like to bring them to a place like this. The fear, the uncertainty, the absolute horror of it. The Cold War had seemed like ancient history to him, something from his parents' generation. But standing in that playroom made it real in a way nothing else had. They found more recent evidence of the Holloways, too. In one of the chambers, hidden behind some old equipment, there was a metal box that Derek had apparently used to store personal items. Photos of his life before everything went wrong. Pictures of him in high school, at graduation, at his first job. Pictures of his father smiling, healthy, happy. A whole life that had been thrown away for $2 million. The thing about cases like this, Agent Robert told James one evening as they sat in the barn command post, is that the crime is almost never worth what people lose. Richard and Derek probably thought they'd take the money, disappear for a year or two, and then start over somewhere new with new identities. But it never works that way. They've spent 22 years running, hiding, living in places like this. 22 years they can never get back. The investigation expanded beyond just finding the Holloways. The FBI started looking into how many other abandoned bunkers might be out there, forgotten and potentially accessible. They found dozens across several states. Some had been properly sealed. Others hadn't. A few showed signs of recent activity, though nothing as extensive as the Holloway case. This could have been much worse, Robert said. Imagine if criminals had used these bunkers for drug manufacturing, or weapons storage, or human trafficking. The Holloways just wanted a place to hide, but these facilities could be used for all kinds of illegal activity. James hadn't thought about that. It made him realize just how lucky, in a strange way, the whole situation was. Yes, 2 criminals had been living under his farm, but they hadn't hurt anyone. They'd just been hiding, trying to survive, waiting for a chance to stop running. 3 weeks after the earthquake that started everything, the FBI got their breakthrough. Derek Holloway had been found in Spain, in a city called Barcelona. He'd been living there under a fake name for the past 18 months, working as an English tutor. His father, Richard, had died about 6 years earlier in Portugal. Both of them had managed to leave the country using false documents, something the FBI was still trying to figure out. Derek was arrested and agreed to be extradited back to the United States. He was tired of running, his lawyer said. Tired of hiding. He wanted to face the consequences of what he and his father had done and, maybe finally, have a normal life again. The sun was barely up when James found himself standing at the edge of that hole again, suited up in a hard hat and safety harness. Sheriff Tom stood next to him, along with Dr. Chen and 2 engineers from the state. Everyone had flashlights, rope, and those little radios that clipped onto your belt. James's hands were sweating inside the work gloves they'd given him. You ready for this? Tom asked, adjusting his own hard hat. James nodded, though he wasn't sure ready was the right word. Curious, maybe. Nervous, definitely. But ready? He didn't know if anyone could be ready for something like this. Dr. Chen went first. She was smaller and more agile, and she'd done this kind of thing before. She disappeared down those concrete steps like she did it every day. One of the engineers followed, then Tom, then James. The 4th person stayed at the top as a safety measure, keeping radio contact with everyone below. The temperature dropped the moment James started down the steps. It wasn't just cooler, it was cold, like walking into a refrigerator. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness ahead of him, showing concrete walls that looked like they'd been there forever. Dust and cobwebs covered everything. The air smelled stale and old, like opening a book that had been closed for decades. "Watch your step here," Dr. Chen's voice echoed from below. "Some of these steps are cracked," James counted as he went down. 23 steps before they reached the bottom. They were standing in a corridor now, and James had to fight back the urge to just turn around and go back up. The tunnel stretched in both directions, disappearing into darkness beyond where their flashlights could reach. The ceiling was maybe 7 feet high, supported by metal beams that showed rust in places. The walls were concrete, smooth and unmarked except for the dust and age. "Look at this," Tom said, shining his light on the wall. There were signs there, faded and barely readable, but still visible if you looked close enough. Yellow and black. The old civil defense symbols that James remembered from when he was a kid. Fallout shelter markers. Directional arrows pointing deeper into the tunnel. "This is from the Cold War," Dr. Chen said, running her gloved hand carefully along the wall. 1960s, maybe late 50s. This is government construction, had to be. Nothing else explains this level of work. They decided to go left first, following one of the arrows. Every 50 feet or so, they'd come across a door. Heavy metal doors, most of them sealed shut with rust and age. A few hung open on broken hinges, revealing small rooms beyond. James peered into one and saw what looked like storage shelves, all empty now with just the metal frames remaining. The radio on Tom's belt crackled. "Everything okay down there?" "Yeah, we're good." Moving deeper in. "This tunnel's bigger than we thought." They walked for what felt like 10 minutes, though James wasn't sure. Time felt different down there, where there was no sun, no sky, just concrete and darkness and the sound of their own footsteps echoing. His flashlight caught something ahead and he stopped. "Hey, what's that?" They all moved forward together. The tunnel opened up into a larger space, a chamber maybe 30 feet across. And it was full of stuff. Tables and chairs all covered in dust. Filing cabinets against one wall. Shelves with boxes and containers, most of them deteriorated, but some still intact. In the corner, there was even an old desk with papers scattered across it, like someone had just gotten up and walked away one day and never came back. Dr. Chen moved to the filing cabinets carefully, testing each drawer before pulling them open. "Don't touch anything yet," she said. "We need to document all of this. Photograph everything in place before we start moving things around." But James wasn't listening anymore. He'd walked to the far side of the chamber and found another corridor leading off from it. And down that corridor he could see light. Not daylight, but something else. A faint glow that shouldn't be there. "Guys," he called out. "You seeing this?" They all gathered at the entrance to the new corridor, staring at that impossible light. Tom unclipped his radio. "We've got something down here. Something that shouldn't be here." "There's light coming from somewhere." They moved down the corridor slowly, more cautiously now. The light got brighter as they went, and James realized it was coming from under one of the doors ahead. An electric light, which meant power, which meant something was wrong, because this place had been abandoned for decades. Tom tried the door handle. It wasn't locked. The door swung open and they all stood there staring at what was inside. It was a room maybe 15 feet by 15 feet, and it looked like someone had been living in it. Recently. There was a sleeping bag spread out on an old military cot, a camping stove on a folding table, and scattered around the room were things that definitely didn't belong in a Cold War bunker. Plastic water bottles, modern food wrappers, a battery-powered lantern that was still on, casting that eerie glow they'd seen from the corridor. "What in the hell?" Tom whispered. Dr. Chen was already on her radio, calling up to the surface. "We need the FBI down here. Right now, this site's been compromised. Someone's been living in this facility." The next few hours were a blur. More people came down. People with cameras and evidence bags and all kinds of equipment. James and the others were escorted back to the surface and told to wait. Questions came from everywhere. Had he seen anyone on his property? Any strange vehicles? Anything unusual at all? James could only shake his head. He'd been working this land every single day. How could someone have been living under his feet and he'd never known? By that evening, the state police had arrived. Then the FBI. James's farm had gone from a quiet piece of agricultural land to what they were calling a crime scene. They found the secondary entrance 2 days later, 3 miles away under an old grain silo on property that had been foreclosed on years ago. That's how whoever it was had been getting in and out without anyone noticing. The FBI brought in their own team of engineers and started a systematic search of the entire complex. Because it wasn't just a tunnel and a few rooms, it was massive. 12 separate chambers spread across 3 levels underground. Some of them were still sealed, their doors rusted shut from decades of neglect. Others showed clear signs of recent activity. One chamber was full of old supplies. Canned food from the 60s, most of it long expired but some of the cans still intact. Barrels of water, though most had leaked or evaporated over the years. Medical supplies in sealed containers. Gas masks, radiation detection equipment. All the things you'd need if you were planning to survive a nuclear attack. Another chamber had been set up as a communication center. Ancient radio equipment, the kind with vacuum tubes and dials and switches that looked like something from a science fiction movie. Telephones with rotary dials. A teletype machine that someone had tried to explain to James, but he still didn't quite understand. The living quarters were the strangest. Rows of metal bunk beds, 30 or 40 of them, like a military barracks. Small lockers at the foot of each bed, most of them empty but a few still containing personal items. A woman's hairbrush. A child's toy car. A pair of reading glasses. Little pieces of lives that had been interrupted or abandoned decades ago. But it was in the deepest level where they found the most troubling evidence. Behind a collapsed section of wall, partially hidden by debris, there was a small room that someone had clearly been using as recently as the past year or two. More modern supplies. A portable heater, books with recent publication dates, and most disturbing of all, a battery-powered security camera system that was still recording. The FBI agent in charge, a tall man named Robert who didn't smile much, spent hours going through the camera footage. James wasn't allowed to see it at first, but word spread fast among the people working the site. The cameras had caught 2 people, a man and a younger man, possibly father and son, based on their resemblance. They'd been coming and going from the complex for months, maybe years. The timestamps on the footage went back to early the previous year, though the agents suspected the cameras had been installed even earlier, and these were just the files that were still stored on the system. "Do you recognize either of them?" Robert asked James, finally showing him some still images printed from the footage. James studied the faces carefully. They were grainy, taken in low light, but clear enough. He shook his head. "Never seen them before in my life." "Who are they?" "That's what we're trying to figure out. We're running their faces through our databases now. Hopefully we'll have some answers soon." 3 days after they'd first descended into that tunnel, James sat in his kitchen with Helen, both of them staring at coffee they weren't drinking. Their farm had been completely taken over. Federal agents everywhere, equipment trucks, generators running constantly. The media camped out at the end of their driveway trying to get interviews or photos or any scrap of information. "I just wanted to farm," James said quietly. "That's all I ever wanted. Work the land, raise our kids, live a quiet life." Helen reached across the table and took his hand. "I know, but maybe this is important. Maybe finding this place matters for reasons we don't understand yet." The phone rang. It was Agent Robert. "Mr. Miller, we've identified the 2 men from the camera footage. I think you should come down to the command post we've set up in your barn. There's something you need to know." James walked across his property, past all the official vehicles and equipment, into his own barn that had been turned into a temporary headquarters. Robert had a laptop open on a folding table and he gestured for James to sit down. "The 2 men we've identified from the footage are Richard Holloway and his son Derek. Does that name mean anything to you?" James thought about it and shook his head. "Should it? They disappeared in 2003, 22 years ago. They were wanted for embezzling over $2 million from an agricultural cooperative about 120 miles from here. Everyone assumed they'd fled the country. Mexico, maybe South America. But they didn't leave the country, Mr. Miller. They've been here, right here, living under your farm." James had been farming the same piece of land in Kansas for 37 years. Every morning started the same way. Wake up at 5:30, make coffee, check on the cattle, and start the day's work. His father had worked this farm before him, and his grandfather before that. The land was in their blood, and James knew every inch of those 150 acres like he knew the lines on his own hands. That August morning seemed no different than any other. The sun was just starting to peek over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. James stood in his kitchen, pouring his second cup of coffee, when the floor beneath him started to shake. At first he thought maybe one of the big tractors had backfired or something heavy had fallen in the barn. But then the shaking got stronger. The coffee mug slipped from his hand and shattered on the floor. The windows rattled so hard he thought they might break. Pictures on the wall swung back and forth, and the old grandfather clock in the corner swayed dangerously. James grabbed onto the kitchen counter, his knuckles turning white as he held on. His heart was pounding in his chest. Earthquakes weren't common in this part of Kansas. Sure, they happened sometimes, but nothing like this. The whole thing lasted maybe 12 seconds, but it felt like forever. When the shaking finally stopped, James stood there catching his breath, staring at the broken mug and spilled coffee spreading across the floor. His wife Helen came running down the stairs in her bathrobe, her eyes wide with fear. "What was that?" she asked, her voice shaking almost as much as the house had been. "Earthquake, I think," James said, still gripping the counter. "You okay?" "The kids?" Their 2 teenagers were still asleep upstairs, somehow having slept through the whole thing. Young people could sleep through anything, James thought. Helen checked on them while James pulled on his boots and headed outside to see if there was any damage. The morning air was still and quiet, almost too quiet. Usually the birds would be singing by now, but everything seemed spooked into silence. James walked around the house first, checking the foundation, the walls, looking for cracks or damage. Everything looked fine. The barn was okay too, but as he got closer to the cattle pen, he could hear them. They were making noise like he'd never heard before, all of them running around in a panic, crashing into fences and each other. "Easy now. Easy," James called out, trying to calm them down. But cattle aren't like dogs. Once they're spooked, it takes a while for them to settle. He spent 20 minutes just trying to make sure none of them were hurt and that the fences would hold.